Asylum seekers learn that President Trump has changed the rules, leading to desperation among migrants waiting at the Mexico-U.S. border and drawing several lawsuits. Then Trump tells 4 congresswomen, all U.S. citizens, to go back to where they came from. What's the strategy behind the president's actions and insults? I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to our discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today, KPBS reporter Max Rivlin-Nadler, Michael Smolens, columnist with the San Diego Union Tribune, and Matt Hall, editorial and opinion director of the Union Tribune. Well, Donald Trump's racist tweets saying 4 Democratic congresswomen of color should go back to other countries roiled the nation this week. Much more on that later on. Yet almost lost in the uproar was the Trump administration's attempt to dismantle asylum protections for those fleeing violence and oppression in their homelands. We first thought that starting on Tuesday, migrants who passed through another country on their way to the U.S. would be ineligible for asylum. That's everyone passing through Mexico, since Trump says they must apply for asylum there first. But Trump's new policy was immediately challenged in court. Here's Lee Gelernt, Deputy Director of the ACLU.
Congress makes the asylum laws. The administration doesn't like those laws. If they want to change them, they need to go to Congress. They can't unilaterally rewrite those laws. So we have gone to court and we have sued and said what the administration has done violates the immigration laws Congress has passed.
All right, Michael, start with you. The ACLU got a pretty strong case here, you think?
Well, it seems they do. I mean, Trump hasn't had a great record on asylum and other issues related to immigration when they've gone to court. He's won some and lost some, but it seems a little early to quite tell. We do know that it's certainly causing havoc at the border, along with the other issues there of people just getting in. It's sort of like the modern day Casablanca, but not that romantic in terms of, that's sort of the way station for people. And what I don't know is, I mean, it seems like just about everybody trying to come here is coming through another country. It used to be, the concern used to be all the Mexicans coming through, and that people don't even talk about that anymore because that's just not the issue.
And Max, tell us a little bit how this story has changed just in the last few days, and what's the Secretary of Homeland Security saying now about the program? Why the change?
What they're saying now is that it isn't as expansive as they originally envisioned it. Of course, that's not necessarily what the rule actually says. The rule actually says that this is going to be applied border-wide, that you have to apply in a country that you've transited through, at least one, for asylum on your way to the U.S. They walked this back in an interview with NPR yesterday, saying, well, it's just a pilot program, but as the ACLU has pointed out, this is not what was actually handed down. What was handed down was a rule that affects the entire southern border, and that's what's being challenged. Right.
So, I mean, confusion is reigning here as they're trying to roll this out or not roll it out, as it were.
Yes, and as has been the case for the past 2 years.
Okay. I did want to stop and make a point here to our audience. We have strived to have a diversified panel for today's discussion. Some weeks reporters we invite just can't make it. But KPBS, the Union Tribune, most American newsrooms have worked long and hard to diversify the ranks of reporters and editors.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about immigration and racism on today's program. It's 4 white gentlemen discussing it, and, obviously we're not going to be able to offer as many perspectives as we'd like.
Right. All right, I did want to point that out. Well, Max, that would be the impact, what would be, I should say, the impact of such a policy on our border if on these thousands of asylum seekers who are waiting there in Mexico?
Yeah, you've got basically now thousands of people, almost all of whom have transited through a third country or a second country on their way to the U.S. Right now you have Cameroonians, you have Eritreans who have gone through 8, 9 countries on their way to the U.S., not to mention the Central Americans as well who have to transit through Mexico. So it's essentially an asylum ban because very few people are not going through that third country. Every day there are a good amount of Mexicans that are applying for asylum at our southern border who this would not apply to. That being said, their asylum claims do hold a little less water than some of the other ones that our people are making. It's just much harder for Mexicans to get processed and get through that system without immediately being sent back to Mexico.
Max, when you say that the Mexicans, the request for asylum hold a little less water, is that because conditions have improved in Mexico? I mean, we know there's a lot of problems there, but...
A lot of violence.
But compared to, I guess, the Central American countries, or why is that it doesn't hold as much water?
Well, we have the ability, the U.S. has the ability to send Mexicans back to Mexico rather quickly, to expedite their removal, and that's something that we do not have the ability to do for Central Americans, because they have to be sent back, at least if they are not part of the migrant protection protocols, which makes them wait out their asylum claims in Mexico. They have to be sent back to their home country, and that takes a long time. They spend time in detention. During that time, they fight their asylum cases, whereas a lot of Mexicans are removed before they even have the opportunity to do that, and in fact are removed oftentimes within 24 to 48 hours of being apprehended by Border Patrol.
And Max, as you talk to these folks down there in Tijuana, what's the reaction now as this policy came to light?
They're as confused about this policy as pretty much any. The idea that they have to sign up for this informal list to wait for the few slots that they're allowed each week.
And that's just slots for a hearing.
That's just slots for a hearing to be processed. So to add this on top of that, I talked to people, they said, some of them had said, yeah, we saw it in the news, but we don't know how that impacts us. We don't know how this is any different than the system as it is. And, show a very, basic understanding of the American asylum system, just as any American would have as well, because it's so arcane and confusing, and has only become more so over the past few months.
Okay. And if this were actually to happen here, would we expect, just common sense tell you, a lot of folks would now try to enter illegally, asylum seekers who now come to the border, turn themselves in, maybe go through the desert, create a whole different dynamic. Who knows?
Right, but the problem is that, this for those who would try to claim asylum by going outside of a port of entry, that would apply to them as well. Even if they were apprehended and spent a good amount of time in detention and were to fight their case, if this rule were to stand, which even high-ranking members of DHS expect it to be struck down by the lower courts, even if it were to stand, these individuals would not be able to apply for asylum because they went through Mexico or another country.
Right. Matt, you had an editorial this week. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. You were talking about asylum seekers, and what's the paper's position on this new proposal?
We haven't weighed in on the proposal itself. We've done 2 editorials this week on the broader issue of Trump's comments, which we can talk about in short order.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
I'm sure. We've weighed in on immigration for years. The paper actually won a Pulitzer in '87 for a series of editorials on immigration reform. We've always been for moderate, thoughtful immigration reform. And so the editorial we had on Tuesday, in addition to talking about racism, talked about how both the right and the left, when they talk about immigration reform, there doesn't seem to be a lot of middle ground, right? On one side, it's abolish ICE. On the other, the position is at least characterized as open borders. And so our take all along has been we need something that we can all agree on, and let's come to the table and talk about it, and clearly that's not happening.
Right. And Michael, you had a column this week that despite the tough talk, Trump has overall been pretty ineffective on illegal immigration. Explain that. What effect might that have on his support overall?
Well, I mean, the support is so balkanized, and the whole immigration issue is so balkanized and divisive at this point. As Matt said, there doesn't seem to be much middle ground, but this is the thing he came in and said he was going to solve. And so it was a bit of a scorecard look. Now, is it all his fault? You can put a lot of blame every place. I mean, for years, if not decades, Congress has not been able to get a comprehensive, overhaul through, and that's really what everybody says is needed. The issue is so volatile, and also just basically the positions are so far apart in some cases. There have been times, in less volatile times, where it seemed like we were getting kind of close. I don't know if it's the Gang of Eight or the Gang of Five in the Senate. Those were different times.
Bipartisan Gang of Eight.
Yeah, right? Exactly. They weren't able to do it. It is sort of interesting that quite literally, the immigration situation is worse since Trump has come in office, which is sort of the opposite of what he promised people. And again, there's a lot of criticism to go around, but is it incumbent upon a president to somehow, if this is his biggest issue, okay, this doesn't work, you move in, do you move in a different direction? But nobody seems to be wanting to really talk about a broad.
Yeah, he came down the elevator famously to launch his campaign in 2015, sticking his neck out there, and that's the point you're trying to make.
Right.
And you also cited polls in that column saying voters overall aren't really crazy about the government's treatment of migrants under Trump.
No, that was pretty strong. And is it really that surprising? I mean, the optics have been horrible. People don't want, unfettered immigration, or the majority doesn't. They want, as I think Matt said, sort of a rational system. What that means, what a rational system is in the eye of the beholder. But I think polls have, repeatedly shown people want, border security. They want, a rational system that works, and it's been a dysfunctional system for a long time. But whether they, how they feel about asylum is another question from just how they think people are being treated. And there's been some first-person encounters. I think ProPublica had a case where they talked with one or two anonymous border agents that had to work in these detention centers, and it was just really eye-opening and very sad.
Yeah, the optics of this whole thing has been interesting. You mentioned ProPublica and the Border Patrol. Their expose on that Facebook group where 10,000 Border Patrol agents, past and present, were saying some pretty nasty stuff, enters into this equation too. But look, Trump took office talking about building a wall and basically shutting down the border, and now the question has become, when you see family separation, and these other optics, when people get into these detention centers and see the conditions with which people are being held, I think to Michael's point about the polling, the answer is somewhere in the middle, but there is no middle right now.
Well, that's interesting. We have another debate among Democratic candidates coming up in 10, 12 days. And at the first one, it was noted, I think you made the note here as you were talking about your editorial, about several of the Democrats, most of them probably, played into Trump saying you want open borders, you don't want to secure borders, and let everybody in, which I think was certainly an exaggeration, but I think they left themselves open to that. Do you think maybe this will become a more nuanced debate? I should say that Bernie Sanders, of all the candidates, said we should bring together the presidents of these countries, bring together the ministers in the Triangle countries, other countries throughout the Americas, and have a comprehensive debate on that, which seems a more reasonable middle ground there. I don't recall hearing another.
The question on that is, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Max.
I would say he's the only candidate that has acknowledged that there's agency and forces at work in Central America and South America that are driving people to come north. If you're just trying to shut down the border, or if you're withdrawing aid, what you're doing is you're making the problem that much harder to solve. And again, you have to look at it whether this is a problem that was going to happen anyway, or one that's simply been created through policies stretching back over decades. To not have a holistic view of that, I think, is a shortcoming of politicians in both parties, but to actually try to solve this issue, it is going to take some buy-in from the countries that these people are leaving. And what does that look like?
Right. What is it, Mike?
Mark, getting back to the presidential candidates, as with everything in politics gets magnified, the more extreme views. There's some candidates, and they might disagree that it's an extreme view, but want to decriminalize illegal immigration, to make it a civil matter and so forth. Other candidates of the 20-odd, I forget how many are actually left.
Haven't checked the last hour.
Disagree with that. Still think it should be, a crime, but deal with it in a different fashion. So there's a lot of angst right now among Democrats, some Democrats who think the only goal in 2020 is to defeat Donald Trump, and they are concerned that the focus on the more extreme aspects, and that's what Trump is doing with, the four congresswomen, really trying to make those people and those policies the face of the party and the policies of the party when they might not actually be. And they polls show they really aren't of mainstream Democrats.
Well, you've transitioned beautifully here because it's time to expand our discussion now. The heated atmosphere around immigration brings to mind an exchange from the 2008 presidential campaign, which seems quaint today. Republican supporter of John McCain said, "I can't trust Obama. I have read about him. He's an Arab." McCain grabbed the microphone. He said, "No, ma'am, he's a decent family man, a citizen that I happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues." That's what the campaign's all about. He's not an Arab. Different era now. This week, Trump tweeted that 4 Democratic congresswomen, all minorities, should go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came. Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ayanna Pressley were born in the U.S., and Rep. Ilhan Omar of Minnesota was born in Somalia and became a U.S. citizen as a teenager. And here's Trump this week talking about Representative Omar in a rally in North Carolina.
Omar has a history of launching vicious anti-Semitic screeds.
All right, Mike, let's start with the politics here. I think that this whole episode is so interesting. Of course, we've had a national discussion. Many Republicans were enjoying an escalating spat between these four freshman reps and Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And Trump managed to instantly unite these women and the Democratic caucus. Was that a smart move?
Well, we'll see. I mean, it clearly was an intentional move. It was a political move, and it's geared towards his campaign. You know, what we saw is the result of his actions or his tweets, you know, was manifested in the chants of send her back in that North Carolina rally. But, you know, I think Trump has found his foil in these four women. They are very, you know, progressives. They have very liberal prescriptions for changing things in the country that a lot of mainstream folks don't agree with. Do they hate the country? No, I don't think you can say that. But, you know, that's been, you know, a trope that's been used for some time, for decades, and always trying to paint the other party as the more extreme. You know, it's a little dangerous for Trump. Clearly, he tried to pull back, as we've seen, saying, you know, he tried to stop by speaking quickly. He didn't. I mean, that, you know, on its face is just a lie.
Well, that was a lie.
Yeah.
Everyone's calling that, frankly, a lie.
But you know, so, but his whole approach here is to not just, you know, rev up the base, but to expand it, to get those people to come up that just don't vote, that aren't interested. And, you know, as it has before, it's taken on a very racial angle that gets pretty ugly.
And it's a long history in our country. Racism, xenophobia, always blame the other. We can go way back into the 1800s. Many historians have this week, Max.
Yeah, I would say just a really quick point that many of the positions that these four congresswomen hold are deeply popular in of themselves. We were talking about Medicare for All polls incredibly well. You know, student debt forgiveness polls incredibly well.
Bold action on the climate.
Bold. Actually, the Green New Deal polls incredibly well. These aren't outside of the mainstream, and actually, I think that's why he has singled them out.
Right. Matt?
Well, we can talk about the new Green Deal, which I'm not sure that is the answer.
No, but some bold action on climate.
But I will say, look, this week is about racism in America. Trump's tweets were racist, full stop. That chant, which I'm very glad you played in its entirety, which Trump disavowed yesterday, but did allow to peter out, and it took about 10 or 12 seconds. That was a racist chant. Look, this is the game being played on the terms Trump wants. And we're going to see what happens there. But I think it's a moment for not just Trump to disavow this, but for Democrats, Republicans, aliens who are purple in skin coming from Pluto. Everyone needs to say this is America and this will not stand, and it's an ugly moment in our history.
Hang on just one second, Michael. I wanted to make a point this morning. I just noticed on the news on the Twitter feed that the CBS correspondent for the White House asked Trump today, how would you feel if someone said Melania should go back home, his wife, and he didn't answer the question? You were going to say.
Well, I was going to say, you know, as Nancy Pelosi correctly pointed out, he's a master of distraction, and that's in addition to whatever campaign divisions he thinks works in his favor. We'll see. But, I mean, I almost felt like today going out and getting a raise of hands, who knew that the House voted to raise the minimum wage to $15? Right. Is it going to get through the Senate? No. Is it going to be signed by Trump?
No, but a dramatic action.
That's, you know, given the change in the House under more calm times, that would be page one news, I think, as, you know, a lot of big moments are that we know aren't going to get all the way through. And that was relegated to in some place I didn't even see news coverage of it. So, you know, and then there's all the stuff with the Cohen hush monies coming up. He knows all this stuff is happening. So, and he knows.
Well, that rally itself on Wednesday, that was the day Mueller was supposed to testify. That got postponed a week.
Yeah.
But a lot of people say, well, that was designed to, again, what you're saying, distract.
You know, Representative Presley, after the tweets and that news conference that they had, she said, you know, we can't take the bait. You know, we can't get distracted. but everybody's in the dilemma, from the Democrats to the media to even Republicans who oppose this. Can you just let it go? You have to address it, and does that even further feed into
even
it?
How do you have the conversation? Because news outlets, it's one thing for me as the editorial and opinion director of the Union Tribune to say it was racist. There are newsrooms, including the Union Tribune, decided not to specifically say that. So now the discussion is it racially charged? Is it a racist comment? And then it gets back to, did Trump lie? Is he a liar? How do we define these words, racist and liar? And I had an email exchange with a reader today who said the Union Tribune editorial board is conflating nativism with racism. So the discussion has almost moved to the terminology rather than what's happening.
Right. And the whole question earlier on about lies, and of course the Washington Post famously has charted more than 10,000 lies, exaggerations, false statements. Call it what you will. We were pretty clear, as we noted earlier on, that this whole thing, I tried to walk it back, I tried to stop it, went on for 13 seconds, and then the diatribe went on. Max?
Well, I think the question over should we cover something like this, how much ink should we spill, is a little besides the point, seeing as though this is who he's been for many years. He came to prominence politically as somebody who was questioning where the sitting president was born.
Right, the whole birther thing was a racist.
I think some maybe frustration that people are having with the news media is, do you have to spill ink every time an instance like this happens, as opposed to saying, what does it mean that the president believes in these things, that the president allows this to happen, even though he walks it back? I mean, honestly, who would buy that?
Well, that segues nicely into something in the graphic we've got for our television audience. For the record, here's what the Federal Economic Employment Opportunity Commission website says about such racially charged language. Ethnic slurs, other verbal or physical conduct because of nationality are illegal if they create an intimidating, hostile, or offensive working environment or negatively affect job opportunities. Examples including ethnic epithets such as comments like, go back to where you came from. That's federal government itself, and people can make a stand on that legally.
Well, Mark, you had mentioned, you used the term history, and this country has had, a sorry history. There's many great things about the country, but there's many things that we have tended to gloss over, and the racial divisions and racial biases have always been there. And, that's coming to fruition again. As I said, that it's part of the nation's id in a certain respect, and I think over history that it's been tamped down by our better angels, and somebody wrote me when I said that, and said, what do you mean, Antifa? I said, no, how about Abraham Lincoln, JFK, LBJ, Martin Luther King? It sort of ebbs and flows, but it does seem that there is that constant there, and the question is, can it be sort of suppressed, if not, to change it? That just hasn't happened in the, centuries that this country's been in existence.
Interesting. You alluded to the debates earlier. It'll be interesting to see, first of all, what happens in the next 10 or 14 days, but then how this issue is brought up or responded to in the debates, because, with 20 candidates on stage over 2 nights, you can't really go deep on a lot of things, but you got to know that this is going to come up. And the question becomes, how much of Trump's approach is what we're talking about, and how much of it is the other side's electability or ideas?
Well, it's interesting because Congress is going to be taking a break, and people will be heading home for a good while. And
most of August, right?
The Democratic members, the caucus is, sort of cautioning, directing, pleading with their members to really, at these town hall meetings, which they all have, and in their districts, stay focused on health care, college tuition relief and things like that, or debt relief. Try not to get too wrapped up in this. It'll be interesting to see if they're successful in doing that, because that seems to be what people are all talking about. All
right, we got just a couple of minutes left. Setting the pace, the president has the bully pulpit, any president, setting the tone, and Trump was pretty forthright this week. This is what he's going to try and make the face of the Democratic Party, these 4 freshman congresswomen. We'll see. I mean, how do the Democrats, is it what you're saying, simply focus so hard on policy and ignore this, elevate the discussion?
They can't ignore it, and defeating Trump is such a motivating factor for so many Democrats, and that's why some think, what we need is just a moderate that's safe. That will win. Let's be careful about, this isn't the time for the revolution, this is the time to beat Trump. People disagree with that. But I think that there was a lot of focus in 2018 on various issues, and not just Trump, although that was such a driving force. So I think you're going to see, those dual approaches, and we'll see if it works. Whether Trump wins or not, I think that this causes the Republican Party a lot of problems in their effort to regain the House, hold on the Senate. I think that's where that's going to be a big problem.
Let's not forget where this began, right? We know that Trump gets a lot of his cues from watching TV, and leading up to this attack that he made on a Muslim woman, on a Puerto Rican woman, on a Palestinian woman, was that the Democratic's own leadership had begun singling them out on single media. They released a poll saying these were deeply unpopular people. Of course, this was only polling white individuals. He was able to pick up that, the Democrats would like to cast these members out and set them apart from them because they feel as if it hurts their electability. And that's what he seized on. And that doesn't happen if the Democrats, were to close ranks and say, listen, we're a big tent. There's a lot of ideas here. And honestly, this makes it a much richer party. But
all right, we're about out of time. We've got that debate coming up a week, 12 days or so from now, the 30th. We'll see what happens there. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Max Rivlin-Nadler of KPBS News, Michael Smolens of the San Diego Union Tribune, and Matt Hall, also of the Union Tribune. And a reminder, all the stories we discussed today are available on our website, kpbs.org. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today, and join us again next Friday on the Roundtable.